Welcome to Talk South Asian to Me, Season 2. My name is Michelle.
And my name is Anusha. Tune in every Thursday at 5 p.m. Central and hear us react to each other's stories about mental health and growing up in different South Asian households.
And remember, this podcast is not therapy. Engage with what feels entertaining and resonates with you, and leave what doesn't. All right, you ready for our G topic reveal?
Yes, I am. We are finally on G, and our topic is
grief and loss.
Yes. Heavy topic.
Mm-hmm.
We've been
Just
doing
like
a lot
many
of this
others.
lately, have we not? I know.
I know. But this is, I feel like, a particularly healthy or heavy topic, and I think it's might be important before I go into research and talking about everything. Just do a disclaimer, that we'll go into talking about grief and like different reasons that people experience grief and loss, and so just a quick disclaimer ahead of time as well. Or it could be even a trigger warning in a way, right? Like if you have experienced grief or loss. So just wanted to put that out there in the beginning. But again, this is an educational podcast as well. And so, of course, we'll start off with some research and definitions. But before I begin, do you have any initial thoughts or anything you wanted to share before I started my research?
In particular, I'm excited to hear what kind of research you have around this. As you can imagine, grief and loss comes up pretty often in therapy work. So it's something I've thought about and something I handle, process with clients almost on a daily basis. It can be a heavy thing. And I think there's also one misconception about grief and loss sometimes, that it looks a certain way. And I think it's really surprising that it can look a lot of different ways. And I'm not just talking about the process of grief, but what you can grieve. So I'm really excited to hear like what you've dug up in your research, and excited to maybe share and fill in some gaps if there are any.
Yeah. I actually have a good amount of experience with grief and loss too, because I did a lot of coursework in this, and when my working in the hospital, especially with the oncology population, we help a lot with coping with grief and loss and teaching kids about these concepts and death and dying. So definitely is something that I'm very familiar with as well professionally. And I remember when I was first learning about it, I had a lot of new learnings as well. Like you mentioned, that grieving could look different. There's different definitions of grief, types of grief. So we'll go into that as well.
Yeah. Okay. You know what I just realized, Michelle? You know what I just realized? You are our guest expert today, even though you're a host.
I'm trying.
Because
you're
right.
We'll see.
Well, this is a good topic for you to be presenting, I think, because, you're right. You do have so much experience in this.
Yeah. And it's hard work, but there's definitely meaning in this work and meaning in this type of work, right? Working with patients and families that are dealing with grief and loss. Okay. So we're going to start off with some definitions, right? Like always.
Love it.
My analytical brain has to start that way.
Got to define it and then get into it. I love it.
Right, exactly. So according to the American Psychological Association, quote, this is straight from the website, grief is the anguish experience after significant loss. It says usually the death of a beloved person, but I'll go into there's other types of grief and different experiences of grief. So grief often includes physiological distress, separation anxiety, confusion, yearning, obsessive dwelling on the past, and apprehension about the future. Intense grief can become life-threatening through disruption of the immune system, self-neglect, negative thoughts. Grief may also take the form of regret for something lost, remorse for something done, or sorrow for a mishap to oneself. So that's kind of like from the American Psychological Association website. And then I wanted to go into defining loss as well. So grief is the experience that you go through and endure when a loss happens. So loss, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is the fact that you no longer have something or less of something.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I wanted to kind of go into a little bit further into the terminology loss. I don't know if you probably heard this term before, called symbolic loss, right? Symbolic loss is loss of something that is not tangible. So like divorce, retirement, development of a chronic illness, breakups, right? symbolic loss is you lose something that you can't touch. It's not tangible, but it's still a loss. You can still experience a loss. And grief can be associated with any type of loss. And, going back into my work, that's something that I see a lot, symbolic loss as well. Like a lot of my patients, oncology patients, they have to get out of school. They're out of school for a really long time. That's symbolic loss, especially for school-age patients. They're away from their friends. The teens, they're away from their friends. They're isolated. When they're having to spend lots of time at the hospital, they're separated from their own family, siblings, normal daily routines. That's another symbolic loss. With chemotherapy, hair loss happens as well. That's still loss. It's not symbolic. But then again, like that feeling of some teens really identify themselves with their hair. So that loss of identity with your hair is symbolic loss versus the actual tangible loss is the hair. So that as well. And then of course the death and dying as well. That's another loss. So I wanted to I have some more research from Psychology Today. And I really like the key points in this article. So I wanted to start off with that, and then we'll go into more. So some key points from this article is this quote as well. Many fail to understand that a range of human experiences aside from death can create and trigger grief. So like you said, right, there's different types of grief. Grief isn't just associated with death. There's other experiences that can create and trigger grief or cause grief. Mm-hmm. A person may mourn their sense of self when a fundamental role they played in their life changes. Right? That's like a symbolic loss when their role changes. When someone doesn't achieve a dream they had, they can feel grief over the loss of their expectation. That's another way to feel grief, is if you have shattered dreams. So I have some more examples of symbolic loss. I kind of wanted to go into more because I think a lot that's pretty taboo, right? When people hear the word grief or loss, they immediately think of death and dying. And I think it's really important to stress that symbolic loss is all around us, and that can involve grief as well. And sometimes it's not talked about as much.
And it's very valid.
Right. So some examples of other symbolic losses are the loss of identity or the loss of role. So examples are a person going through a divorce who feels the loss of no longer being a spouse, a breast cancer survivor who grieves the loss of sense of femininity after a double mastectomy, an empty nester who mourns the lost identity of parenthood in its most direct form, right? So that's kind of the loss of a role or identity. Another type of symbolic loss is loss of safety, the lost sense of physical, emotional, and mental well-being. So survivors of physical, emotional, or sexual trauma who struggle to feel safe in everyday life, right? They are experiencing that loss of symbolic loss, which is a safety, right? Families experiencing eviction and housing instability who feel unprotected and unstable. That's another example of feeling a loss of safety. Children of divorce, parents who grieve the loss of safety in the intact family, though they might not articulate this way, but again, that stability of having that intact family, that could be a symbolic loss. Another type of symbolic loss is loss of autonomy, the lost ability to manage one's own life and affairs. So a person with a degenerative illness who grieves the loss of physical or cognitive abilities, right? A lot of people who experience Alzheimer's or dementia, they might experience this type of loss. An older adult no longer able to care for themselves who grieves their decline, right? That could be another type of loss of autonomy. A person experiencing a financial setback who feels a lost sense of autonomy as they rely on others' help for financial needs. That's an example of a loss of autonomy or independence. So what are your thoughts? Any questions, or what are you thinking about all of this so far?
Yeah. Well, right off the bat, I mean, that is exactly what I was thinking of when I was thinking of grief or loss. And today's episode, I was thinking of all the ways that we don't really automatically think of that can be losses for us, that we grieve, and how it's not often really normalized. So I'm really glad that that's like the first thing you're getting to right away, is because more often than not, most of the grief and loss that we deal with on a day-to-day usually is symbolic. Of course, we might have real losses in our lives, but we know that that's something that we lose, something that we grieve.
Right.
Whereas the symbolic ones, like you said, they're just not really given enough space to be acknowledged or validated or space to be felt. I'm really glad that we're talking about that.
Yeah, I think it's really important to normalize this conversation for sure. So now we dove a little bit deeper into loss, and I kind of wanted to go into grief now, which is the experience. Right. So I found this article again from Positive Psychology. It's called The Psychology of Grief, The 4 Stages Explained by William Smith. So there's a theory out there. It is, I don't know if I'm saying the right name, but it was this theory. I think it was 2 theorists or 1 theorist, Kubler-Ross, and they theorized 5 stages of grief. And this was a theory that was published in 1969, and a lot of clinicians and specialists use these stages of grief to kind of define grief and how people experience grief. But it's still again, it's not a one size fit all. It just can help structure the process of grief in a way to help understand how grief works. So I wanted to start off, the author did a really good job starting out the article saying that grief is normal. It's not an illness. And sometimes that can be mistaken very easily. Oh, this person is grieving their lost loved one, or they're grieving this type of symbolic loss. They need help, right? It's really important to accept that grief is normal. It's part of the human experience. Okay. And again, to go back to the definition, it's an intense emotional experience that's triggered by a loss, and it's normal. Some symptoms that people who are grieving can experience is physical, cognitive, emotional, interpersonal, and lifestyle. So physical is loss of appetite, difficulty sleeping, loss of energy, fatigue, weeping, wailing. Cognitive, feel a sense of dissociation and distance from reality, feelings of disbelief, confusion, poor memory. Some emotional symptoms are guilt, anger, anxiety, despair, hopelessness. Interpersonal symptoms are social withdrawal, resentment, isolation. Lifestyle symptoms are failing to perform daily routines and self-care, resigning from activities. Okay, so those are kind of the symptoms. And then I wanted to go into the theory a little bit more, the 5 stages of grief. And so this article is from on Harvard Health. The author is Jennifer Fisher, published in December 12, 2023. And this kind of discusses the 5 stages of grief, coping with the loss of a loved one. But again, these 5 stages are fluid, and it can be applied to different types of loss, not a loss of a loved one only. So the first stage is denial, unable to process the loss, refusing to accept or acknowledge. The second stage is anger. So because the person is denying the loss, it can cause feelings of frustration and bitterness, blaming others or your religious deity, blaming a doctor for not preventing illness if it's, a death that happened in the hospital or loss that happened in the hospital, blaming oneself. So that's the denial, anger. The third stage is bargaining. So thinking about the what ifs, the if only, attempting to negotiate and make compromises, seeking means to reverse the loss in return for a sacrifice. This can involve religion, spirituality. So bargaining is the third stage. The fourth stage is depression, so feelings of sadness and hopelessness. And then the last stage is acceptance. The person comes into terms with the reality of the loss. These stages were listed in this order, but I've been taught, and I've been again said there's no timeline. There's not one size fit all. It might not go in the same order, but it does involve some of these stages. I've been also talking about this recently in my therapy sessions. And so we actually have seen a video of this, but my therapist and I talked about it too. I don't know if you've seen the mason jar and the ball analogy, where it says, yeah, I'll post it and I'll share with you. It's people tend to believe that grief shrinks over time, but what really happens is that we grow around our grief. So the grief is a ball inside a mason jar, and the ball stays the same size, but the mason jar becomes bigger. So we grow around it. So the mason jar is us, and the grief is the ball. So the ball still stays the same size. It's just the people around, or the person is growing or learning to cope with it through time. So I think that was like a really good visual analogy for that. And then I wanted to go into types of grief. So the first type of grief is complicated grief. You probably heard of this. This is from the Positive Psychology article. Complicated grief represents an issue that warrants a clinical approach, as the grieving individual needs professional intervention to avoid spiraling into deeper trauma. So in other words, if normal grief is a medicine, complicated grief is a serious allergic reaction to that medicine that requires medical assistance. So that was a good analogy that the author of this article put. So complicated grief is kind of that you need that professional support, more intensely having those symptoms and interfering with your daily life.
Yeah, more layers to process through, not as intuitive sometimes.
Right. And then this is actually really common. I wanted to talk about anticipatory grief, which is feeling grief over an upcoming loss. So loss hasn't happened yet, but a lot of people who are like forward thinkers, they're thinking ahead, they might experience anticipatory grief. The author of this article from the Very Well Health, they say that it does have some benefits because it helps you find closure. It might help settle differences or prepare yourself for the pain of letting go. But it could come with a lot of emotions like anxiety, guilt, fear, irritability, losing sleep, problems concentrating, making decisions. And all those symptoms are normal for anticipatory grief. Yeah. Any things you wanted to add in on those types of grief?
I was aware of this future-oriented grief, but I've never heard it referred to as anticipatory grief. That's kind of interesting.
Oh, really?
Makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. And to add to that, I would also say, usually the way that I think about it, or at least the way that it comes up in my therapy work with clients, is that sometimes they grieve something that will no longer happen. I wonder if that is anticipatory grief, because it's not something they're anticipating necessarily. It's just no longer accessible. What I mean by that is, for example, let's take someone who goes through a breakup, right? Perhaps they've imagined what their life would be like if the relationship continued. Perhaps they imagined a marriage. Perhaps they imagined their partner being a good parent.
I wonder if
that life is no longer.
Right. I wonder if that part of grieving is like the bargaining, like the what ifs, and like that stage of grief. But I don't know if it's an anticipatory or not. I think that's a good point.
Yeah, because it doesn't strike me as anticipatory. It's rather just a layer of grief. The layer of grief.
Like a stage of grief. Yeah.
Yeah. No, not even a stage of grief. It's like just a part of grief. Sometimes when we grieve, we're grieving a loss of something. But sometimes that loss could also be an imagined future.
Right.
That's
Which it could be a symbolic loss. That's very insightful. That's like a loss associated with a symbolic loss, like the symbolism of losing that potential future with that person. That's a symbolic loss.
Yeah, it's giving me more symbolic loss than anticipatory, because anticipatory seems more like it's going to happen and you're grieving it already in preparation.
Yeah.
But if this breakup has already happened, it's not.
Yeah.
It makes more sense to think of it that way.
Yeah. Look at us being insightful together.
Look at us making connections.
Yeah. But that's a really good example. That's a good point that you brought up.
Yeah.
Because
the other thing about the stages, I will say too, you already kind of started saying it, but I want to highlight more on it. You said that the stages don't always go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it can look very differently. I want to add that I think that it's not just about not following a certain order, but it's also about repetition, right? Just because you've come to maybe a place of acceptance one day with the grief doesn't mean that you can't also go back to another stage of the grief.
It's not a straight line.
Grief is not, it doesn't end. Our griefs come with us in life.
We grow around it, like that mason jar analogy.
That's an interesting analogy. I've never heard of it phrased that grow around it.
We grow around our grief. Like our grief doesn't really go away. I'll send you this picture. It's really neat. It shows you the difference. I've
I
actually
can't
watched
wait
a
to see
video
it.
about this too, like a long time ago. I think it was probably in my grief class
Okay.
or something that I
Probably.
watched this video. Yeah. But it's a really good visualization.
Yeah, and I can't wait to see what it looks like because I'm also a visual learner. I feel like that would hone in a little bit more.
Yeah.
But the way that I usually view grief is more so around the idea that grief is something that we do carry with us for forever. But it's something that sometimes like is really large and takes up your entire space in the room.
Right.
And sometimes is small enough you can carry in your pocket. Sometimes it's really loud and like shrieking at you in your face. Sometimes it's a quiet whisper. Sometimes it's like a person talking to you at a normal decibel. I've seen grief more as something that grief itself grows or lessens, grows or lessens. I've seen grief as a thing that moves.
Interesting.
I've never thought about grief being like a stable point.
Yeah. I think it's just like helping someone understand that grief doesn't really just go away. Like it can come back. It stays. And it can show up in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's a lot of analogies out there like the one you mentioned. I think all of those analogies probably make a really good point. The same point about how grief can look different. Grief can show up differently. You know, people cope with grief differently. And it's important to remember, like, even if someone is not discussing or talking about the grief or the loss isn't most recent, doesn't mean that person's not grieving. I think that's really important to point out.
Yeah. Doesn't mean they're not over it.
And I like you have mentioned, like, even if a person goes through stages or reaches acceptance, it doesn't mean that they can't go back to like the denial or the anger. Like it's not a straight line at all. Yeah. And that's kind of like coping. That's something I very ingrain in like my caregivers and patients' brains. Like coping is not a straight line in general, right? Coping is not a straight line. And it's important to remember that. Okay. So I researched some of the articles, kind of talked about some tools to help cope with grief. So one that I saw repeatedly was support system. So like family, friends, professionals like therapists, licensed counselors, support groups, support grief groups, grief support groups, religious, spiritual leaders, seeking medical help and support as well. All those things can help a support system. And then I found another list that was more kind of like changes in your daily life or being intentional in your lifestyle that might help with coping. So developing a daily routine, adhering to a healthy diet, focusing on exercise, sleep schedule to help you focus on the things you can control. Celebrating the life, if it was like, you know, a loss with the person, right? Celebrating that experience with that person, or, you know, if you did before, or if it was anticipatory grief, like experiencing that life with that person together, making those happy memories, or if it's a symbolic loss, then, you know, being grateful, but focusing on the things that you do have, right? Or like the time that you did have it before, if it was before the symbolic loss. So considering taking steps to honor memories, right? Finding meaning. This could be from like photos, sharing stories, establishing a memorial, working on finding joy. So allowing yourself to experience joy during difficult times can help improve your mental state and provide long-lasting health benefits. And then, of course, learning about the process of grief. So like reading, listening to podcasts, or more educational resources on how grief works, so you can be more self-aware of how your own grief is processing and working. Yeah.
Good tips.
Yeah. So that was kind of like my general research for grief and loss. And now we're going to go into the juicy part, which is South Asian community.
I'm very curious what that looks like.
Did you know that there's a whole website called the South Asian Mental Health Initiative and Network? Have you ever heard of that?
Salmon? Yeah, I'm a part of their directory.
You are? Oh my gosh. I'm just discovering this when I was researching. I was like, this is so cool. And they had a good amount of articles on grief. And so the one I really thought was relevant for today is called, are you ready for this? I love this title. Like, it's so applicable. Grieving Through Shame. Disenfranchised Grief in South Asian Culture. Even when I saw the article title, I was like, already. This is it.
Powerful.
Yeah, this is it.
Yeah.
The author of this article is, I think I'm pronouncing it right, I might be wrong, Shika Patel. who is a licensed clinical social worker. So I'm going to just kind of, I didn't want to paraphrase, because just the words were so powerful and so meaningful. So I'm kind of just going to read some quotations from the article that I kind of extracted. So first, the author kind of defines disenfranchised grief, because that's pretty jargony. So disenfranchised grief is an experience of grief that is not validated or supported by the social world of the mourner. When we examine the experience of grieving in South Asian culture, it's important to acknowledge that some individuals, families, and communities will grieve in silence without support or affirmation. Unfortunately, the values and beliefs that maintain the model minority myth and silence as strength continues to persist when a family member or loved one dies, right? So I think so far I was like, yep, this is something that I've seen growing up, very applicable in the South Asian community, just like through my lens. And then I really, really liked how the author kind of provided like a 3-step model on how to challenge this idea, like disenfranchised grief. So she says, I offer a 3-step model in challenging this disenfranchised grief. So 1, the first step, start with identifying your own biased beliefs, internalized messages, and thoughts surrounding mental health. Educate yourself on mental illness, depression, addiction, suicide as being valid forms of health conditions. Join community space. The step 2 is joining community spaces where these conversations are being cultivated, and find safety and connection with others who have experienced similarly. So creating a community with people that are affirming and validating, right? Yeah. These types of loss or grief. When this is another quote, when stories are told in safety, we find that shame begins to dissipate, which makes sense. And then the third step is acknowledge that acknowledge that your grief is valid, and that losing a loved one to any form of a mental health condition is a form of loss, even if your community or culture cannot validate this for you. Grieve in a way that feels best for you, and find healing on your own path in your own unique ways. So I thought this was really powerful, because not only this author kind of talks about grief in general, but like, how does grieving in the community change in reaction to how the death occurred in the community, which is so valid, right? I feel like when there's a mental health condition involved, it's pretty hush-hush. It's pretty silenced. I've seen that firsthand as well. And I think, and that's not okay at all, right? That there's shame that's integrated as well. So I know.
Make sure I got this right. So the 3 steps that she offers. 1 is to educate around these topics. 2,
and identifying your own beliefs and like your internalized messages.
Right. So I understand how you see these concepts. Educate yourself.
Educate yourself.
And then 2, seek out support.
Or join community spaces. Yeah.
Community spaces that have maybe similar experiences, or who can be at least validating, affirming, true support systems. So that's the second piece. And the third piece was
acknowledging
grieve the way that you need to grieve without putting like restrictions on the way you grieve. Well said.
Right?
Yeah, that's well said.
I was like, yes, this is so good. Like this is something that's not talked about at all. And I think, till this day, I see this happen, where there's shame involved when it comes to grieving, or silence is strength. I like that quote that she put.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's just a lot of guilting and shaming that's kind of embedded subtly, and sometimes not so subtly.
Yeah.
As much as we can call it out, and as much as we can not normalize it, move away from it, the better.
Exactly. And it starts with conversations, right? And education. First step.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And then I found another article from, the website's called Therapize India, but I did like this quote that I got from his website. It's called 3 Ways of Dealing with Grief and Loss in a South Asian Context. So this quote is, it is important to understand that being vulnerable in front of family members is acceptable, It makes space for acknowledgement and acceptance of the loss and the pain. It allows you to share your pain and heal together. So I like how this article kind of brings in that piece of like, yeah, this stuff is hard, right? You're going against the norms when you are showing pain or grieving a loss. You're vulnerable in front of the family, right? But that acknowledgement and vulnerability can be fruitful in the long run. Okay.
Although I have to say the one caveat to that is sometimes there are families who, no sugarcoating way of saying this really, they're just toxic. They don't have the willingness or ability to hold a safe space. And in families like that, you don't need to be vulnerable and grieve in places you know you're not going to get a space.
Exactly.
To be you, to feel.
Yeah.
So in those instances, maybe family is not a good place. But in general, for those families who are willing and able to grow together, definitely. Great advice. Yeah.
Okay, so I know that was a lot of research because there's a lot out there. So I'll go into my story, but it's pretty short. It's pretty quick. Do you have anything to add or anything that I missed? Do you feel like it's worth mentioning for grief and loss? I feel like you added some really good points.
Really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a relevant topic in our line of work.
It is very relevant. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I did a little reflection on my life and my experience with grief and loss. So I kind of started chronologically. So thinking back into my childhood, I was privileged to not experience death of close loved ones. Most of my grandparents had passed away before I was born. And the one who was left, which was my maternal grandpa, he lived in Pakistan. I only met him once. He passed away when I was 8. So I did see my mom grieve, right? It was a loss for her dad. But I didn't really experience that grief at that time when I was 8. But I will say that I did experience a lot of symbolic losses in my life that I wanted to mention. So when I was in 2nd grade, my childhood best friend moved out of the country, and that was really hard for me. I still remember how sad I was. And that was a symbolic loss. I was really close with her. She was my only close friend in school. And she left in the middle of the school year too, which was even hard because I had to continue school with her not being there. I also experienced symbolic loss when I moved away from college, symbolic loss involving my time with my parents and sister. I also had a dog, my last 2 years of high school. You probably remember Romeo. And so we had to give him away to a family friend when I went to college, since I was the primary caretaker. I was moving to the dorm and they didn't allow dogs and all of that. So that was very sad and heartbreaking because I grew very attached to him because we also got him during the time of turmoil in my family, the separation of my parents and things like that. So I was very emotionally attached to Romeo as well. But he's very, I'm very happy that he's with a great family. So that made me happy. And, I've been living separate from my parents for the most times, for most of my rest of my life up to this point, ever since I moved away from college. There was a 6-month period I moved back home, but other than that, since 2013 to now, I've been away from my parents. Even when I moved out from, after senior year of high school, I moved to college. My sister experienced symbolic loss. I did too, because ever since she was born, we shared the same room. And so I remember her calling me after a couple nights and she was tearful. I was a little tearful. And she was like, the bed is empty next to me. And I was it was very emotional for both of us. So that type of symbolic loss. But I think after getting married, I started feeling more of some of the symbolic loss more intense, right? I started spending more time with my in-laws. And so I started feeling that symbolic loss with my parents, that time with my parents' sister even more. My parents live in a different city than me, my husband, and my in-laws. I live 15 minutes away from my in-laws versus my parents are a 4 or 5 hour drive away from home. And so I think I started feeling that more intensely, having to split my time that I spend now that I have 2 families to spend time with, right? I started feeling that symbolic loss even more. I started also feeling anticipatory grief for my parents. Shortly after my wedding, my uncle passed away, and that was hard for me. And he was someone who I grew up with. He attended every like important event in my life. We always celebrated the birthdays of all the cousins like every year. So he would be at every birthday party. And my uncle, my parents were part of the same generation in a way. And so my anticipatory grief for my parents even intensified even more after that happened. Seeing my parents getting old, you know, not have like now having to spend a lot of time with my in-laws too, right? Going on trips with them versus only my parents has made me realize that life is short, and I've talked about this in my therapy sessions, hence that analogy that we talked about. And I know we talked about in my research too, like usually when people feel anticipatory grief, that it can help them get closure or really do the things they want to do. And so I've been like trying really hard to be intentional with my parents, telling them how much I love them. We want to plan a trip vacation together. Like very recently, like I went to my cousin's wedding, and he had this very beautiful backyard, like intimate ceremony, like close family only. And afterwards that night after dinner, we were all like, it was beautiful weather in California. We were just chilling outside, and in the backyard, the food was in the front yard. And the backyard had glass doors. And so all of us were like laughing, the cousins, the uncles, the aunts. And my parents were like, they're big jokesters. They're like to make everybody laugh. They're so awesome. And so they didn't eat, like during dinner, they were doing it. So like they hadn't eaten yet. And so the food was in the front yard. So they were in the backyard with us, and they were both going in. And we are like, everybody was like, where are you going? And they're like, oh, we haven't eaten yet. So we're going to go get our food. And so where I was sitting, I could see through the glass doors in the kitchen. And then to go to the front yard to get the food, you have to turn the corner after the kitchen. So I was just watching my parents walk, and they were like laughing all cutely together, walking into the house, past the kitchen. And then when they turned the corner, next thing you know, I don't see them anymore. And like that kind of hit me in the moment. I was like, they're like out of my, like it was just symbolic, like, oh, like they're out of my sight, and it was just emotional. Like I remember like I started bawling, and this is like at a wedding event. So I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to keep it together. But everybody was very emotional at that time too, because it was very couple weeks after my uncle passed. And so people were still pretty emotional at a wedding event, after a death in the close death in the family. So everybody was like, why are you crying? Are you missing? Like they were thinking about my uncle. And I was like, yeah, like, it's just everything all at once. And like I told my cousins, like my parents, like they're the same generation as my uncle. And my parents have like sat me down so many times, which doesn't help my anticipatory grief. Like, oh, like, we're getting old. Like, that conversation, we're getting old and this. So it's like not easy. Like it's really hard. And so I think currently in my life, I've been experiencing a lot of anticipatory grief and working on like how to cope with it through therapy, and focusing on how I can tell my parents how much I love them and intentionally spend more time with them.
Yeah. So that's beautiful. And that's a really, really wonderful way to see the anticipatory grief is, refocusing on what you can control and making the absolute most you possibly can of what we do have right now. Yeah. It must have been really hard to hold all of that.
Yeah. I still get emotional sometimes about it. Oh, you're so sweet. But I love talking about it in therapy, and I think that shame and that like feeling of like the disenfranchised grief, like you shouldn't be crying over this. Like it's still there in the back of the head. So I'm like working on like, it's okay to feel this anticipatory grief. It's still grief. It's still like experiencing these emotions. So yeah, work in progress.
Absolutely. Well, you are handling it really well, and I'm proud of you for even, bringing it up in therapy and working through it, because grief is one of those things that's just like, it's a pestering, annoying, gnawing voice that won't shut up until you deal with it. And then you can deal with it, right? So it's hard to feel, hold, and deal with, but I'm proud of you for doing it anyway.
Thank you. Appreciate you. Love you.
I love you. I want to give you a big squeezy hug next time I see you.
Yes. I would love that.
Well, thank you for sharing. I mean, that's a really vulnerable thing that you're dealing with right now, especially, and continuing to deal with. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
My brave girl. I love you.
Love you. Oh,
Oh,
it
look at
hurts.
that. I love that.
That was so cute. Okay,
That was
Riverside.
well timed.
Yeah.
That's a FaceTime video, I think.
Yeah.
I knew there was a reason to turn those reactions
Oh,
off.
I love it.
Okay. Well, anything else you wanted to share before I share my story?
No, that was my story. I'm ready to hear yours now. I'm sorry I talked for a long time.
Not even. Well, my story is kind of similar-ish, as always. Although I will say that when I first started thinking about grief and loss, obviously the first thing I thought of was what I'm dealing with right now. But I'll get to that in a moment.
Okay.
I'll go back a little bit.
Okay.
The first experience that I can recall, at least, with grief is when my maternal grandfather passed away when I was in 7th grade, I think. And it was my first experience with a grief and a loss to that degree. We were pretty close. I mean, I've been pretty close with my grandparents in general, but particularly my maternal grandparents were like really goofy and silly and like really doting and just had so much energy in life. And so they really kept up with me as a kid. And so I was pretty close with them. And that was a difficult experience back then. And I also didn't know like how to deal with that grief. You know, when you're young, like we talk about the blueprint for how to be and how to feel and how to think comes from other people. And so this was my first experience or opportunity, if you will, to learn how to deal with grief. And I saw a lot of stages of grief. I mean, obviously I was too young at that time to really understand or identify it really well, but I saw the stages of grief with my mom, with my aunt, who I'm really close to both of them. And it was confusing. It was really confusing, not understanding like, okay, what's happening? I was young enough to not really understand the level of grief that they were experiencing, because not only did he pass away, but there was also an element, he had cancer. He passed away from cancer. He was going through treatments, and there was an element of temporary concealment of his cancer during a certain period of time, so as not to worry everybody. And then again, when he died and passed away, we weren't really told. Somebody in India called my dad, and my dad basically was like, he's not doing so well, we should go. He didn't say that he had already passed away, because he knew that, you know, my mom and my aunt would be kind of crying and in a bit of a mess, you know, trying to travel there. It was a long way to travel. And so he didn't say anything until we got there. There was just a lot of like little things around that grief. And so it was quite an experience to have and to understand how other people grieve, understand like what I was feeling, how I was grieving. And it was also kind of confusing because, again, being that young, I was like, okay, but I'm not feeling the grief the way they're feeling grief. Is there something wrong with the way I'm grieving? There was a lot of confusion at that age and just lack of understanding.
Which makes sense, because how old were you again?
I was in 7th grade.
Okay.
So I think 12, maybe 13.
And just like, I would say like around that age, you're just developing abstract thinking, and death is a very abstract concept.
Yeah.
And so, and emotions are abstract too, right? Conceptualizing those. So it's very normal and valid that you were feeling the way you were feeling, right?
It was already a confusing time being in your, you know, early teenage phase. It's an odd time for sure. But there was inherently, intuitively, I suppose, things that I kind of sought out, like little mementos. I still have the ring my grandfather used to wear often, and I kept it. I used it for a long time. I don't wear it as much anymore, but now I keep it close. It's kind of like a memento when I see it, or there's I have a little car, a red car that I used to play with them one summer. I remember when I was much younger, and I've kept that car, and I only keep it because it's a reminder of that summer. And I think looking back now, it was actually the summer when he got diagnosed, but he still showed up. And I was so angry that summer when I was young, because I was like, why aren't you spending more time with me? Why do you keep going to appointments? And, why am I hanging out with only my other grandparents? Why aren't you involved? But the moments that summer that we did hang out, we would play with that toy car. And so I remember now, as I hold on to it and keep it, that's what it reminds me of, that summer, and recognizing, even though I was angry, not great, but I was young, didn't know what was happening. Even though I was angry, what it actually reminds me of is their love. Because even though they were going through all of that hardships and whatnot, they still tried so hard to make that summer fun, and they still tried so hard to take me places. Well, I can't imagine what else they were feeling and going through in that moment. Yeah. That was my first experience with loss in that permanent kind of way. And then, of course, my other grandfather died more recently when I was in college. And that was also a bit weird. I noticed I was grieving a little bit differently. And it was also a different experience. I was the last person to talk to my grandfather before he passed away. In his, it was nighttime. We had a conversation. It was really simple, really nothing. He had just said, "Do you want me to lock the door?" And that's it. And I gave him a hug. I gave him a kiss. And then I sat outside to talk to my cousin. And then the next morning we found out he wasn't in bed. It's because he walked out, passed away on the street. Yeah. So it's different kind of a grief, but again, I was kind of hit with the same type of grief, except this time I could identify my stages of grief. Being the last person to talk to him and realizing I was right here when he walked away. Why didn't I see? What if I could have, been next to him and had a conversation with my cousin, or, whatever. Going through the stages, that was a different experience. And it was also the first time that I was consciously aware of a little bit more of performative grief from extended family, and how that felt weird and odd. It was also a time that people told me, "Don't cry. People didn't want you to cry."
Yeah.
Disclaimer: cry. If you need to cry, cry. There's nothing wrong with crying.
You shouldn't. Yeah. Nobody should tell you don't cry. Yeah. You should, nobody can tell you how you feel. So if you feel like crying, you cry. Yeah. Crying isn't a release. There you go. It's cathartic.
It is. It's very cathartic. If you gotta cry, just cry. Crying just makes other people uncomfortable because they don't know how to comfort you. But that's okay.
Their discomfort is not your responsibility.
Absolutely.
Kudos to my therapist. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. And other than these tangible deaths that have created a lot of loss and grief for me, other more symbolic in nature losses and griefs I've been dealing with. My health, we talked a little bit in various episodes of my health and the state of some of the ways I've discovered my health issues and concerns. And I think for a long time it was difficult for me to accept that I needed to make changes in my life that were necessary. And I was not willing to make those changes because I was clinging to, well, I just want to be without worry. I just want to be without having to put extra effort, put extra intentionality. And that is a loss. Yes, I am losing a life where I was not intentional, but that lack of intentionality has led me to where I was, and that was in a bad shape. But it took a while to come to that realization that in this case, that was something I needed to let go of. On the other hand, the kind of grief and loss I'm experiencing now is not a loss I need to let go of, but it is something that I needed to accept, which I have. And the grief and loss I'm talking about around this is my parents and my aunt and uncle, my second set of parents, moving back to India. Most of the time, like we've been talking about, a lot of this grief and loss is so central to death and permanent things, but this is a very real, constantly evolving loss and grief I experience. And it's different in the way of the other things were more permanent. My health, permanent. There's no evolving nature of it. It's permanent. That life is gone. My grandparents not being in my life, or my grandfather's not being in my life, that's gone. That's permanent. Whereas this, my parents and my second set of parents not being here and being in India, that's an evolving grief. because we don't know what the future holds. Maybe they'll come back. Maybe they won't. Maybe they choose to settle. We don't really know, right? It's evolving. So it's different in that way. But it's like I was talking about earlier too. It's not just a grief of what has happened. I also have a grief of the loss of an imagined future, right? I imagined a future where if and when I have a child, they would be surrounded by them on a weekly basis, every weekend, getting to spend time with their grandparents and, just being able to have that support or, the fun, the memories, whatever it is. So it's not just a grief that they're gone, that I'm losing the family time or the memories that we've built, the traditions that we have, but also a future life that I had imagined. And that's grief for me with all of this. What was that?
No, I was saying the symbolic loss, shattered dreams. That's a type of symbolic loss.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly. And it's a big one. That was a really big one for me to contend with, is not just what I lost past, because I'd gotten used to some degree of that going off to college and not living home anymore, but the future that I thought I would return to. That was a big one.
That's really hard. I'm sorry.
Yeah. But the thing I've realized about my grief, at least with this in particular and in general, is that, like we've been talking about, grief comes and goes. Sometimes for me, the grief is like a quiet whisper of the loss, of the sadness. When I remember old memories or when I see old pictures, sometimes they send old pictures and I'm just like, oh my God, so cute. I'm like, look at all this fun we had and how babyish we all were. But sometimes that grief shows up in kind of like a sharp, stinging pang of longing. When I see them having fun or celebrating things without me now, and like, obviously really I'm excited for them, but it's hard to not be a part of it.
Right. They're continuing the traditions that maybe once they shared with you and now you're not there.
Exactly.
That's really hard. Yeah.
Yeah. And then sometimes, as you would expect, it is out of nowhere, like an overwhelming wave, consuming me whole from all kinds of emotions. It's not just the sadness, but it's maybe the anger. Maybe it's the sometimes feelings of abandonment even.
Yeah.
Even though I know it's not. Feeling is a feeling.
Feeling's a feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. And other times when I'm luckier and have in more of my acceptance stage of it all, it's a bit more peaceful. It's a quiet moment where maybe if I'm lucky, I don't really see it. I don't really feel it in that moment. It's just different. And it doesn't mean that I have not accepted it. It doesn't mean that I am not happy for them. But it just means that it's something like we're talking about. It always just stays with you. And there's going to be moments where it grows and it's yelling at you in the face. Some moments where it's quiet and a little bit heavy in your heart, but it's manageable.
Right.
And sometimes when it's not really there, it's very just a dull moment. But it's always there. One shape
or form
or volume or another.
Yeah, you're right. I like how you listed how you have experienced the different stages, with this loss. I just can't imagine having your parents on the other side of the world when you're still trying to continue your life.
Yeah, it's hard, especially because I'm not a phone person. I can't pick up the phone and just talk to people. It's
hard, yeah.
I need people in person in front of me to really like feel connected. So I've been, and I know I shouldn't. I know I should change, even though I don't like using the word should. I know that I have the space to change that about myself, but for some reason it's been a bit harder.
It's a process.
This grief.
It's a process, and there's no right or wrong. There's no timeline. So even though you're putting the word should, right?
I know.
You could say in due time, right? In time.
Yeah.
Hopefully things will you will stay in that acceptance stage longer, maybe, But again, coping's not a straight line. Your feelings, all your feelings and all your stages are valid.
Yes, they are.
It just shows how much you love them and how much they showed you like their love and their presence around you.
Yeah, to want to be around them, right?
I mean, I will say you're coping really well with this. I'm having a hard time just being 4 hours away. It's interesting how our grief right now at this stage in both of our lives is around our parents in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Not to mention, my parents are fairly healthy and fit for their age, and they make 50 look really good. But recently my dad has, within the span of a couple of months, when I was in India in February, he tripped over something and fell.
Oh, I remember you telling me.
He couldn't see it. He hurt himself. And then most recently, frustratingly, he tripped over, when you park, there's a thing in front of the parking, the divider or whatever.
Yeah.
He was talking, turned around, tripped over it, fell, hurt his ribs. Thankfully, nothing serious.
Okay, good.
But simply the fact that he hurt himself again falling just has me in a state of like absolute worry and like fear, anticipatory grief, as you've now given me a word for it.
You learned something new.
I learned something new. I have a word for it now. It's anticipatory grief. And I'm trying not to think about it too much, but it's frustrating. And obviously it's not anything he could have done on purpose or did on purpose, but still, he's so far away. If I wanted to be there for them, it's hard.
It is hard. And, in being both of us being in professions where we hear about other experience of grief and loss or witness, like, I see it happen, or you can't help but think about your own, like, experience and your own loved ones, and like you want to hug them tighter and you want to be with them more. It's different when you do this type of work. Like, it's almost as if grief and loss, it's really hard to not take it with you or take it in. Like, you have to do a lot of intentional self-work to kind of leave it at work, really like separate it, because it's so intense.
Such good boundaries with that.
Yeah, there's so many layers. Like, even I didn't talk about this in my story, but like another symbolic loss that I probably experienced growing up and still working through, and I've mentioned this in other episodes, is like my sister dealing with chronic illness and my parents dealing with them. Like, I experienced symbolic loss in that way, right? Like the attention of my parents. And then I know I mentioned this, like when I work with siblings, like in my work, like it's just like a different feeling of when I work with them. It's like more relevant and resonate more.
It might even make you feel a little bit heavier that day, right?
Or even like self-healing. Like, I'm helping the sibling feel love.
That's beautiful.
Like, whenever I do sibling sessions or sibling coping sessions, like I'll tell them, like, Mom and Dad love you just as much as your brother or sister. You're so important to them too. Just what your inner child needs. I know. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm telling them what I needed to hear.
Yeah, that's so amazing. So beautiful. That's so self-healing, like you said. Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating that we ended up in these kinds of professions.
Right. Oh, wow.
It was a heavy topic, but I think it was a good one.
Yes, thank you for sharing about what you're experiencing as well. I know it's I'm sure it hasn't been easy, and I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing about it on here.
Of course. And also, if Mom, Dad, if you're listening to this, I love you, and I'm okay with your move. Don't take everything I say to heart.
Aww.
Okay, bye.
We love you, Auntie Uncle, and so much love for you and Usha. Right? Love, heart. Oh, there it is.
You got to be careful with that one. Imagine if that happened in therapy. We're talking about serious things. Tears.
Hearts are still like an act show of love or care when something serious is happening.
That's true. There was one time, I will say, accidentally fireworks or balloons.
Oh no.
Or maybe both happened.
That's not okay.
And I was like, I'm so sorry.
It's not okay. That's so funny. I'm trying to imagine that.
It gives them a pause to laugh about it, though.
Yes, exactly.
Get out of the heaviness.
There you go. All right.
Alrighty. Shall I wrap this up?
Yes.
Okay. Here we go. Another podcast. Another moment. Here's a reminder to our lovely listeners. If our podcast has resonated with you and you'd like to share your story with us or ask questions, you can reach us at talksouthasiantome@gmail.com or find us on any and all the socials at the handle @talksouthasiantome. See you all next time.
All right. Bye.